If you could fault Armored Core 4 on any aspect of its presentation, you might point out how it's missing the series' obsession with hidden storytelling. You might also point out that the competing creative visions gave us a story very much in the Armored Core format, but whose conclusion left open a gash which the Armored Core conventions have thus far not addressed, meaning some new component needed to be imported into the license to incorporate the remaining struggle from the end of the last game into this game. There are many angles to tackle making a sequel from, and for Armored Core for answer, the brain trust over at FromSoftware seems to have decided to create an alternate version of what we got in Armored Core 4. What if the tightly directed missions were all about highlighting the insignificance of the player character? What if the layered plot required some deep examinations on characters like Maximilian Thermidor, and what if the central conflict is not in the mindless pursuit of power or the struggling destitution left behind by a cataclysm, but instead it's about the day when the Earth can no longer sustain the way human beings live on it? It's the mechs, or me, baby. For Answer reuses most of the core components of Armored Core 4, but it feels as if they went out of their way to find new ways to bring out the best of what the revamped formula from there had going for itself. The spin-offs to the older Armored Cores range from being little more than mission expansion packs to being what felt like bona fide entries in their own right. Armored Core for Answer does a neat thing where it doesn't really change all that much from Armored Core 4, but the changed focus from that game's open battlefields to this game's more tightly directed Colossus fights goes to show just how expressive the revamped Armored Core mechanics truly are. For Answer does not make a lot of changes to the gameplay from the last time around, but the production has very much been recalibrated to fit a different feeling experience, and I am here for it. Hi. As usual, I'm AesirAesthetics, and this is the 5th entry into my Armored Core series retrospective. If you haven't already, I'd recommend watching the previous videos because I'll be building on top of a lot of ideas from there going forwards. I would especially recommend watching the Armored Core 4 retrospective, since this video is a direct follow-up to that one, and since the script for this video and that video were written at the same time. There's a lot of crisscrossing ideas in these two specific videos, so like I said, you might want to check that out before watching any further. Public service announcement done. Now, grab yourself a cup of coffee and prepare to comment some of your own thoughts on the phenomena we're talking about as we dive into Armored Core 4 Answer. Every numbered Armored Core title has reset the ground rules and creative scope of the license. The specific narrative from one numbered game rarely gets advanced by the happenings in the next numbered title, and the positive gameplay overhauls to the spin-offs to the previous title are, usually, standardized with the numbered entries, so that the spin-offs to them can take those for granted. Like how Project Phantasma introduced the arena, and then when Armored Core 2 came, that feature was baked into the basic experience. There were 11 games released prior to Armored Core 4, and they all had contributed to the evolution of the core formula established in the first game. This continued pile-on to the core framework might explain how they were able to crank out 3 Armored Core titles in 2004 alone. They were very familiar with their tech, and even though they took some weird detours along the road to the 4th game, like that time in Formula Front where the non-North American modified version of the game didn't even let you pilot the UACs you were designing, even though there were a lot of weird detours, the heart of the presentation had never been strayed away from. The closer you come to the end of the 6th console generation's Armored Core games, however, the more you begin to notice that they are playing dress-up with a tank control mech simulator from 1997. Engine familiarity is a good problem to have when it means you're cranking out well-selling games to a devoted fanbase, but the longer that procedure runs, the more the engine familiarity comes at the cost of a high barrier to entry. Asking newcomers to sift through layers of the presentation to get at the core game only to greet them with a very primitive 5th gen third-person shooter is not an endeavor they could have kept going forever. But changing things up comes with another issue downstream of the way they'd been making the Armored Cores, which was that a lot of the standardized phenomena of the license was built on top of very deep fundamentals. And if you tinker with those fundamentals in any significant ways, the mechanics built on top of them begin to break down in deep enough ways that rebuilding new mechanics is faster than trying to refit the old code to the new core sentiment. This is why the team they assembled for Armored Core 4 cannot be celebrated enough. That team took a look at the tangled mess of mechanics the franchise had been collecting over the years and decided that they actually would hack at the deepest layers of the game's makeup and solve for all of the ensuing design problems. The characteristic difference between the 4th gen Armored Cores and the earlier gen games is speed. Faster movement, faster combat, faster missions. Movement is already core enough to any game since it defines the boundaries of good level design and since code pertaining to things like wall collisions and pathfinding often takes speed into account. But because these are action games, basically every mechanic in the mission part of these games had to be reconfigured to support the new creative direction of the series. The balancing act we got in the 4th game was that damage outputs were higher than before, the positioning sequence of firefights was drawn out, flight times were lengthened, energy regenerated faster, and the movement was handled with joysticks as a default. At launch, fans did not universally take to these changes, and the complaints raised would get addressed in Armored Core 5, for better or worse. Stay tuned for that video. But for whatever my opinion is worth, I not only admire the developers for accepting the task they'd set for themselves, I really like how the changes came out, and specifically I'm a fan of how the changed presentation priorities allowed for a variety of new kinds of missions and new kinds of game directorial techniques. For one, since we were so much faster in the 4th gen Armored Cores than before, the maps could be much larger, and since it was a 7th gen game, there were a lot more assets which could be rendered on screen at any given time than before. The tighter control scheme allowed for battles which can take for granted fine-tuned movement from the player, and the best examples of those we saw in the 4th game was when we got involved in massive battlefields. Armored Core 4 sped up the experience, and then Armored Core 4 Answer came a little over a year later and ratcheted up the scope of the missions to match. The tight scenario direction and the jetburst jousting mech fights from the previous game are back, but this time we also have the arms forts. Gigantic moving mechanized fortresses which take advantage of the zippy-zoomy fine-tuned movement the player now has access to. Boss fights had never really been the series' strength up until this point. The mech mirror matches had always been held back by the slow and clunky presentation format of previous games, and when those games tried to give us different kinds of bosses, the interface on our end was simply too primitive to let those bosses really express themselves, since they needed to be defeatable with the same clunky inputs the rest of the games are beaten with. The weighty, clunky presentation in the older Armored Cores made tremendous sense for the sentiment those games were expressing, but like every design choice, it came with some limitations on what would and would not work. The slow movement made for a lot more effortless mood setting than anything the 4th gen games have going for themselves, but since Armored Core 4 stripped out the limiting factor of the clunky presentation and gave us precise, fine-tuned movement, the designers could finally give us an Armored Core game with some really epic bosses. Assuming of course you apply the regulation patches, which unlock the fights. Blighttown was never as bad as the unpatched version of the bigger arms forts here. Game design is largely a question of trade-offs. Nothing comes for free or without baggage, good and bad. Much of quality game design is knowing what changes are worthwhile and which ones are creative dead ends. Like I already noted, they had made 11 entries into this franchise before the 4th game, so they probably reached a stage where they could plan new titles by instinct alone, but Armored Core 4 changed everything. Making 4 Answer work was going to require realizing the latent potential of the new framework, and where better to start talking about that but by picking up where the story cliffhanger in the last game left off. 4 Answer takes place 5 years after the last game. There, the supreme authority of the world was a cabal of megacorporations, and their rule was the Pax Economica. In the Lynx War, this order was destroyed by the collective efforts of one Joshua O'Brien and the Anatolia mercenary, the player character. They fought to preserve the independence and freedom of their home colonies, but after destroying the Pax Economica, O'Brien attacked Anatolia and was put down by the player. This is where the world seems to have collectively stopped to take a breath. Since the ending of the last game, the lingering entities of the corporate order have re-emerged as the League of Ruling Corporations, and they've reassumed control over most of the world. They do the grunt work of preserving world peace, but they do so to maintain their own prosperity rather than that of mankind. Up until the fourth game, the Armored Core games had morally dubious, at best, characters and organizations, and the resolutions to the conflicts those games presented always looped back to the question of humanity and power. Into whose hands should the power to govern mankind be placed in the light of the previous order not being acceptable? The games have struck at this question from numerous different angles over the years, but the ending to Armored Core 4 was different, because the Anatolia mercenary didn't destroy the existing order and tried to create a new one. The Lynx War wasn't blown off because the fighting was done. Sure, O'Brien was out and Anatolia was more or less on their own, but they had the greatest mech pilot in the world on their side, and the Pax Economica was in shambles. Another push and the remaining corporations could have probably been destroyed. The fighting also didn't end because the Anatolia faction refused to pick up the slack of governing the world. We see in this game that those who support the League of Ruling Nations have formed the Linarch, which is an ocean-based city-state. They're all about freedom and democracy and stuff, but because they're so radically accepting of volunteers to their cause, they've attracted a lot of undesirable elements which have corroded their society, and the dreams of the founders are not really being represented anymore. The enemies of the Pax Economica have tried their hand at establishing a new order, but they didn't pick off the rest of the corporations because they've come to realize that the corporations are not as dangerous as fighting them is. I'm a big fan of when metaphysical concepts are involved in the actual physical reality of a work, and in the 4th generation Armored Core games, we see that the idea of deposed order, of chaos led run amok, and of boundaries being broken and not replaced, these ideas are represented in-universe with the Kojima contamination. Kojima particles power the mechs and the machines, and the more mankind fights, the more these particles damage the environment. If they had kept at it, Fiona and the Anatolia mercenary might have been able to destroy the corporations, but the Kojima contamination they'd inflict would have been immense. And this contamination is destroying the planet. The ideals of the Linarch run in opposition to the realizations of those ideals. They object to the tyranny which characterized the Pax Economica, and they oppose the Kojima contamination of the League, but because they're an open society, their city is falling to pieces, and without mass manufacturing new Kojima particle vomiting machines of war, they are incapable of taking down the League. They don't amass an army to force the cradles down, their weapon is defensive, and its name is White Glint. The Lynx War, which broke the Pax Economica, saw a massive outpouring of Kojima particles. In my video on Armored Core 4, I talked about how the disentanglement of social order and the sacred boundaries which make up the world resulted in, Miyazaki's staple, Keigare. That is, once the formal structures of the world are undone, the physical and spiritual environment begins to degrade because they become optimized for and shaped by forces outside of the natural order, and the longer this unstructured state persists, the longer the powers above mankind refuse to look at the problem underneath their society, the more those problems will rot the world they insist on governing. The particles were used to power the war machines, and after the war which broke the central authority of the Pax Economica, the planet was polluted by them. The League of Ruling Corporations adapted to the Kojima contamination and built the Cradles. Gigantic hovering cities which rested high enough in the atmosphere to not have Kojima contamination afflict them. These cities are powered by the Arteria, ground-based power plants which generate more Kojima contamination. In the previous game's backstory, the breaking of the governments in the National Dismantlement War was justified by how the national governments were incapable of addressing the issues of the resource and food shortages which came about from the overpopulation. People insisted on an order capable of addressing these existential issues, and this led to formal power leaking out of the national governments and into the hands of the corporations which then formed the Pax Economica. That system had its own issues though, with colonial slavery, the mech economy and such, which justified the Anatolia mercenary breaking it, but the order which replaced it was met in its inception with a polluted planet, and the solution they came up with was to ignore the problem while simultaneously perpetuating the Kojima contamination. Eventually, the Arteria power plants will have polluted so much that even high up in the atmosphere, the cradles will be affected. At the time of the game, half of humanity lives in the cradles, and should the contamination absorb them, most likely the cradles will be grounded again, and the entire world will be like the surface world is during this game. A poisoned battlefield where mercenaries eke out a living in the economic war until the contamination has become so total that no man can survive anymore. The Lynx War concluded with the factions pulling back and deciding that they would not impose a new structure on the world wholesale. This was a compromise, and it was not acceptable. Something needs to be done to save the world, and this is where the player comes in. We play as Strayed, or the Colored One, or Lynx of the Collared, or Lapdog, depending on who you ask and what translation of the game you have. Strayed is another Lynx fighter, and in the early part of the game is doing missions for both the League and the Linemark. But as you can probably deduce by his many nicknames, this is not a person with a lot of agency, at least not early on. But before the game ends, it will fall on him to decide what the fate of mankind shall ultimately be. The idea of a world whose natural order has been somehow twisted and whose inhabitants are made to languish in an unacceptable stagnant horror story is an idea which Hidetaka Miyazaki, the director of this game, has gone back to very often. The story from the last game was, in broad strokes, very in keeping with the titles which had come before it. Even though it introduced some new ideas like making the Raven's Nest our home colony and emphasizing the pollution subplot from previous titles as a core part of the main narrative, even though it introduced these new ideas, the franchise staples were what contextualized and drove the experience. For Answer's story is an expansion on the new elements, and even though I don't have documents stating it outright, the fact that these ideas have been repurposed for every Miyazaki game since this one makes me confident in saying he had a freer hand in writing the story this time around. Speculation, this is just speculation, but I feel very confident putting it out there and assuming that this was the case. The difference between the world presented to us in Armored Core 4 and For Answer is seen in the bigger maps and the shift in priorities from fighting armies to fighting big fortresses. There is a lot of spillover in the mission design. For Answer has not altered the core formula enough that the best practices are radically different, but if these games ever bleed together in your mind, you can more or less be sure that when you fought the big epic mechs, you are playing For Answer. And an interesting thing about this story is that we're getting to see the hidden past of previous games play out. Not continuity-wise, this is not a prequel, but the premise of the lore from Armored Core 1 and 3, that mankind had to live in subterranean cities because the surface world was destroyed by some massive cataclysm long ago, that premise is what the 4th gen games are all about. Is mankind doomed to live underground to escape from the surface world they poisoned? And if the answer is yes, you can kind of see how the crazily fast and advanced technology here would degrade in the underground world and devolve into the clunkier machines of the older games. If this is the sort of technology the above-ground world had, it makes sense that so many factions in the older games were obsessed with scouring the surface for it. If they'd have made a sequel set in this world's continuity, which depicted the subterranean survivors coming to the surface though, I'm not sure how much of this tech, if any, would still be usable since it would have been baking in Kojima particles for centuries. And on that, That's actually the one major complaint I do have about this game. We hear a lot about the Kojima contamination, but it isn't present in the actual environmental design, like it probably should be considering the game's premise. You think of a mech game whose environment is dying from a dangerous technology and you'd expect to see the levels themed around this, but instead things look more or less the same as they did last time around. Back in Armored Core 2, we were on Mars, and the developers didn't incorporate that setting very deeply into the gameplay. The game felt a bit floaty, but the lowered gravity and such which came with the location wasn't there. If they ever considered incorporating something like that, they probably decided against it because it just didn't jive well with the core mechanics and the best practices of mission and encounter designs of those mechanics. In that same vein, for this game, I can see how putting Kojima contamination into every level might undermine the strengths of the core gameplay and alter the player's intuitive sense for how to navigate, since the KP contamination would mean a slowly ticking down health bar is omnipresent. It is possible to incorporate the contamination in more passive ways, like having the weaker, cheaper radars malfunction more often or something like that, but instead, we have the environmental design we have. It's good, don't get me wrong, but the moments we get of sheer brilliance makes me think about how I don't think the average map is really all that impressive in its layout or in its theming. I like how the extended draw distance, compared to earlier gen Armored Core games, allows for the actual environment and level design to do some player direction more so than the minimap does, but the strength of the missions is definitely in the encounters in the maps. My favorite moment in this game is when we're disrupting those cannons on the mountain. Aside from the small and inconsequential grunts, this is about the most relaxed any mission gets, and spending a minute navigating up the mountain with these hectic mech action mechanics was such a nice change of pace that I felt myself wanting more of this. The game is very fast, so more moments of quiet time I think would have been nice, if only because the ambience this stuff generates is really good. I've talked in the past about how I like it when developers lean on unconventional and unintuitive utilizations of their core mechanics to deliver experiences which are outside the immediate conceptual scope they provide. Ratchet & Clank Into the Nexus is a talky, actiony, cartoony kid game, but there are sequences in there where it's just the crushing loneliness of the cold world, and the flight mechanics were used not so much to let you move across great distances, but to pull you really deep into an empty world. Those moments, intentionally or not, were very atmospheric and warrant further experimentation if they ever decide to make good Ratchet games again. Some more examples of developers utilizing mechanics to present experiences outside of the regular wheelhouse of those mechanics is when tank-controlled survival horror games decide to dump the player into really open spots. Usually, the crushing claustrophobia ambience is preserved with the control scheme alone, but since the environment is so open, you feel even more exposed than you do in the cramped hallways, ubiquitous in those sorts of games, because threats could come from anywhere. And I'd also fold Souls platforming into this. The movement there is not optimized for snappiness, and there are no mechanics like jump-assisted nudging to ledges to bring out that sort of experience. Instead, you navigate the tight platforming sequence in those games with the same dungeon crawler movement as the rest of those games have, and I love it. For the 4th gen Armored Core games, I do feel like the emphasis on speed came at the cost of pacing. Every mission more or less begins right when you started rather than having any sort of ambient build-up at the start. Because there are so few times where the games just slow down and let you breathe, I feel it's harder to compartmentalize the experience, and at the end, a lot of the activities blend together because there wasn't a stark change in gameplay to clearly separate the missions. I also feel like the 4th gen games fatigued me a lot more while playing. There's a heightened emphasis on twitchy reaction timing and such, which drains your mental energy a bit faster, but I do also think that the constant overbearing sense of everything is happening right away, and there are 100 things on screen to pay attention to, didn't exactly help with this either. I wouldn't have felt confident in this criticism if I didn't have the examples of the few slowed down ambient moments we do get in the 4th gen games, but since we have them, I must say I'd have liked more of them. Not just because those moments are great, but because they nicely contrast against the bigger, more bombastic moments. Like the gigantic arms fort fights. The arms forts are how the League presents on the surface world, and the idea with the arms forts is that they inherently distribute power because they require so many hands to pilot. The League feared another Lynx war, and they saw that their mechanism for imposing order could not be the mech pilots because those are individuals and they can have a change of mind. One person with power is a threat to the League, but if power is distributed amongst a collective, the League has nothing to fear. In the game's story, it's interesting that this was the takeaway the remaining corporations had from the Lynx War. And because we need to justify the conflict in the narrative this time around, the order of the League is fundamentally optimized around safeguarding what they have rather than trying to solve the issues plaguing the world. So resources are dumped into creating arms forts rather than trying to fix the Kojima contamination. Anyone can piece together that this order is not in harmony with the planet and that, long term, it will destroy everyone. Some of the factors which changed what the best practices in mission designs were came downstream from the fourth game's emphasis on speed, and others were the jump to a new console generation which removed a lot of the technological restraints which limited the games before. Some of the most significant changes for the sake of best practices in mission designs include the longer draw distances, the extended flight times, and the overhauled movement scheme. And these changes all make a strong case for this game's decision to feature more gigantic mech fights. The extended draw distances compared to the older Armored Cores give us a better visual of the larger arms fort's enemies. The extended flight time enables us to navigate around them for longer, weaving around them and threading our way between their limbs and cannons and such. And the overhauled control scheme, specifically the integration of the joysticks for movement, allows for the fine pixel-perfect movement that is required for mech fights where we need to periodically land in the right spots or we need to gently navigate towards the arms fort's weak spots. I feel compelled here to mention that Miyazaki left his job at Oracle and took a pay cut to join the video game industry because a friend of his got him to play Ico. You can really feel Ico's influence in the subsequent Miyazaki fantasy games, but in this title I'm much more so feeling that he was taking cues from Team Ico's Shadow of the Colossus. Oftentimes the arms forts are fought by just landing on them and doing a lot of damage to them, but the best ones always have the encounter direction of the Colossi from Shadow of the Colossus, in that the player is not just swinging a sword at them to drain a health bar, but rather they are navigating the enemy or luring them to exposing themselves in order to reach a weak spot. The Great Wall Arms Fort, for example, is a gigantic train which we need to fly past while avoiding fire. Then, once we reach the tail end of it, we need to infiltrate the thing and reach the core at the other end, which we can destroy to cause the whole thing to explode. There's even a sequence where the cart we are in is detached from the train and we need to make our way across the gap between them. The Stick Row is an arms fort which is fought in former Chinese Shanghai. The place is flooded and the enemy moves super fast and has a gigantic energy blade on it, so the player is made to lure the Stick Row into the skyscrapers to slow down its movement so they can do some damage. The Caprican is another great arms fort enemy because we have to make our way underneath the thick metal plates which cover its tracks in order to attack it, but once we're there and once we've deactivated the Caprican, it opens up and releases a massive swarm of flying enemies. So the mission has us pin ourselves under the fort only to then make us break our way out again to face a massive horde of enemies with the deactivated arms fort now only acting as cover. Fumito Ueda, the director of Shadow of the Colossus, explained that the Colossi were designed like inverted Zelda dungeons. In Zelda dungeons, you get a key to open a door to reach the endpoint. In the Colossi fights, you trick the Colossi into exposing a climbable path up their bodies to attack weak points to reach the end objective of killing them. I love that conceptualization of boss design, and even though the arms forts here are more primitive than what we saw in Shadow of the Colossus, I love the epic design and setup of the AF Answerer as much as the next guy, but
This is about as primitive a fight as it gets. Still, some of those lesser AF fights aside, I feel the Shadow of the Colossus sentiment coming through, and I'm wondering if this is just a case of great minds thinking alike, or if the team over at FromSoftware was consciously inspired by Team Eco. The arms forts are one way we see the failure of the League to properly manage the society which they've de facto inherited by being the strongest faction in the end of the Lynx War. They make massive war machines and supercharge the Kojima contamination of the planet in order to secure their hold on power while evading the serious long-term ramifications of the methods they employ to keep that power. Another showcase of them failing to address a serious problem with the order they inherited is that after the Lynx War, they didn't disband the Lynx. They are still using them for when they need more surgical strikes than what the arms forts can deliver. The Collard is the Raven's Nest of this game and acts as the middleman between us and our missions. Its name, like our name, evokes the idea of something which does not act on its own accord, even though its true nature dictates that it ought to, and this is sort of true to the Raven's Nest evolution in the 4th generation. The 4th game personalized the mission management organization by making it our home colony, Anatolia. But now, the mission middleman organization has been made into a faceless and unempathetic money machine again, and it's actually under the control of the League itself. I like that the Collard is reinforcing the idea of the entities in this world being without agency, but even putting that aside, I can see why the developers went back to this formula rather than continue the setup they had in the last game. For Answer has a branching narrative, and this has us switching factions, so locking the mission provider down to a singular location might not have worked as well this time around. There's also the specific narrative to consider. This is a very global game. We aren't fighting for the fate of our colony, the future of mankind is what's hanging in the balance here, and the developers did not pull any punches in letting us explore the ramifications of the choices they put on the table. First time around, we advance through the game like we always have in the Armored Cores before, but once we've beaten it once, we can enter a new Game Plus cycle where we keep all of our stuff. This lets us approach earlier missions with the endgame gear, which is really cool, but also very economic because it lets us speed through the early parts of the game to reach the branching points. There are some new missions which unlock, and if we do everything right, once we get to the Defeat White Glint sequence, we can swap sides and join White Glint in defending Lineark. Throughout the early part of the game, we have been accepting missions from Lineark and the League, and this is the point where Lineark is taken out. If we fight White Glint, we find ourselves teaming up with a mech called Otstarva to take our protagonist from the last game down. Defending Lineark has us teaming up with White Glint to defend Lineark from Otstarva and another mech called Cube. Otstarva is the highest ranked Lynx in Collard, and him being the best is why the League sends him to take out White Glint. Cube is the pilot of the Fragile mech who is associated with Aspina, which, like Otstarva, is affiliated with Omer Science Technology, which is one of the major players in the League. However we choose to go about the White Glint mission, White Glint will be taken out, and the Otstarva mech will malfunction. If you chose to protect Lineark, you will be rewarded with White Glint's mech parts, and if you want to honor the memory of the player character from the previous game, you can play through the rest of the game LARPing him. The parts are very well optimized, all things considered, but the best case for using his parts is what it always is when it comes to FromSoftware armor choices: fashion. Overboosting with White Glint gives you the epic Angel Wings, and this is the good stuff. It's wild how much variety the games can pack into the mechs considering the simplistic build rules which have governed this series since the first entry. The stomach, to which every other part connects, is the core of the build, and the additional parts are locked in the sockets which the cores offer. There are some parts which do not mix together with other ones, but for the most part, provided you stay within the weight parameter of the mechs, you can assemble the thing any way you want. Every mech part has its own properties. For example, the arms govern aiming speed and the legs govern turning speed. And while we don't have the optional parts from the second game anymore,
We have FRS points we can dump into these tuning screens to improve our mech in some capacity. So if you really want to use some heavy shoulder cannons on your stick figure mech, these can be used to increase your load capacity to make that dream come true. If you want to have more speed on your tanky build, you can improve your boosters, or you can increase your energy output in case your build gets winded too easily. The core fundamentals of the customization screen have not really been strayed away from in these games, but the added jank of optimization variables to the parts and the added part types underscore the fundamental ethos of the Armored Core games. I've talked about this before, but the series was originally conceived of for the PCs and designed for a more hardcore simulator player base. The combat was never bad in the old Armored Cores, but it was very primitive feeling and clunky. That was seemingly the intent, with the mech fantasy of those games definitely feeling more like the developers wanted to put you into the head of the pilot rather than the mech, and so flashy, expressive, tight reaction timing was never the highlight of those games because the core ethos of those older games didn't really gel with that kind of presentation. Armored Core 4 does not aspire to fulfill this same sentiment, and the combat is actually really fun. I talked about this in my video on the 4th game, but whereas the older games made the player complicit in the evils of the mech economy by feeding them misleading and sanitized mission briefings, and by getting the player caught in the perpetual rat race of needing more money for new parts to be better at the missions, the 4th generation games get you complicit in the evils of the economy by simply making the game really fun to play. The paychecks we get in the 4th gen games are very generous, and there's no cost to failure anymore. So I'm never really looking at the monetary rewards when I accept missions. Instead, I'm looking at what I think I'll have more fun doing, and that's a different, sinister way of expressing the vicious mech economy. Since the entire experience was thrown in such a loop with the changed emphasis on speed, it would have been very easy for the sentiment of Armored Core to be lost, but the new presentation style and the recalibrated mechanics managed to convey the same message in a different way. With the loss of White Glint, Lionarch's greatest weapon, Lionarch ceases to be a major player, and instead, the economic war becomes centered around the fight between the corporations and Orca. Orca is the military arm of a secret faction within the League who believe in the closed plan. That is that the most important battle is the one which will destroy the assault cell satellites orbiting the planet. In a big reveal, we learned that those things were actually designed by the corporations before the National Dismantlement Wars to destroy any aircraft which tries to escape Earth's orbit, to ensure that no other corporation can possibly make headway into space because it would grant that company too much advantage in case of a conflict. Ray Leonard, the company responsible for Kojima Particles, realized the danger of their technology, and their intent was to destroy their competition on Earth and then leave the planet. But Ray Leonard was destroyed in the last game, so now their plan lives on in Orca. Orca is led by a man named Maximilian Thermidor, a fitting name for a revolutionary man who is leading an organization which is a secret splinter faction of the insane ruling government. Maximilian from Robespierre, who enacted the Reign of Terror, Thermidor for the political faction, which eventually took control away from him and then executed him. Maximilian Thermidor's arena bio describes him as a complex, if not divided man, and I think it's interesting that the developers pulled from both factions of the Reign of Terror when naming him. His arrival into the story feels very in line with how Leos Klein dropped into the middle of an ongoing conflict in the second game, but For Answer has multiple endings, so unlike how it was in the second game, we aren't locked on the path set by the newly emerged revolutionary figure. In the first ending, the League sends us to deal with Orca and stop them from taking control of the Arteria, the energy factories which power the cradles. We succeed, but the lingering problem of Kojima contamination persists, and while the cradles stay aloft, it's only a matter of time before the rot their existence inflicts on the rest of the world finally rises to the cradles themselves, at which point the planet will be too far gone to be saved. In the second ending, we help Orca instead of the League, and do some missions for them which eventually result in us taking control of the Arteria.
It's in this story branch that we come to really know Thermidor, and if you do a bit of deep diving, you'll notice that he has a very similar weapon configuration that Otstarva did, and that he has the same voice actor as Otstarva, in both the English and the Japanese dub. The ramifications of the Orca leader also being the highest ranked fighter of the league comes back to Maximilian's bio, talking about him as a divided man, and he might initially have been instructed by Omer to assemble Orca in order to gather together the enemies of the league in one place to create a counter-faction which would chip away at the league while leaving Omer's interest untouched, such that once the closed plan had been completed, Omer could rise up in the league, gobble up the leftovers of the other members, and take control of the entire planet, since Leinarch, Orca, and the rest of the league would all be too depleted to stop them. This would rationalize why Maximilian would, in the guise of Otstarva, assault Leinarch in the first place, when White Glint was pretty much the greatest weapon which could possibly be released against the league. Rather than make common cause, Leinarch needed to be neutralized because White Glint was not a factor which Omer could hope to control. Whatever the case for Maximilian's real loyalties, in the second ending the Cradles all lose their power and land on the surface, leading to mass death from exposure to the Kojima contamination. The energy the Arteria used to send to the Cradles is then redirected to destroy the armed autonomous satellites, and even though the Cradles are no more, humanity has a future because they can go to the stars and try again on a new planet. I talked earlier about how the premise of this game is the lore of the previous games, and while this ending might sound like the good one, take note that however you approach these two endings, you are playing into the hands of the corporate powers. That the surface world has already been blasted for years with Kojima contamination, which does not feel like the sort of stuff which just cleans itself up, and that even if mankind makes it to the stars, this wouldn't be the first time this has happened. Armored Core 2 took place in the same continuity as Armored Core 1, and there's a subplot in that game where ancient technology is discovered on Mars. Contrary to what I thought when I first played the game, the implication is not that this is alien tech, but that it's the remains from an older human civilization which also made its way to Mars and perished. The only thing left from the spacefaring society in the first continuity's lore is the technology they left behind for the humans who retreated to the underground world to wait for the surface to once again become hospitable to find. And even if we make it to space in the ending of this game, who's to say that things won't go exactly the same way? The mech economy has not been resolved, and whatever future awaits this world will surely have a reckoning when the forces shaping the mech economy itself will finally have to be called into question. And as far as I can see, this force seems to be that the human beings in this franchise are obsessed with power. This obsession pours into every component of their society, and every technological development is just another escalation in the destructive powers of the mechs. The player character is the straight, someone who does not act on their own will. There are schemes within schemes in the main story here, and even the good ending leaves a lot of the core problems the story started out with unresolved. The implication of our name was that we'd gradually break free from the power above us, but instead, we either destroy the world or hand the future over to Omer. Remember how in Armored Core 1, Human Plus was a hidden easy mode? It was the economy failure state, where if you lost enough money, eventually the corporations would just sell your body to medical science. You'd get some sort of difficulty release valve in exchange, but your name would be removed from the ranking because they took away your humanity. This development echoes that. The story they set up for us is a lie. Straight is a talented pilot, but nothing more. And if you actually want to have a crack at the power above you and make an impact, you have to move away from both of the easy endings and walk the path of the Old King. For the third ending, you must confront Old King in the arena fights to unlock the genocide path. Old King is an insane mech pilot whom we team up with to destroy the Cradle 03 system. 5 mega cradles, all housing 20 million people for a grand total of 100 million inhabitants. In response, the Collared sends a team of Lynx to take care of us, and while Old King dies in the battle, we don't. We overcome the squadron and proceed to destroy every cradle left in the greatest atrocity ever committed in the history of mankind. Like how the case would be in Demon's Souls 11 months later, the path of the Old King is the path of destruction. The answer to the conflict in Armored Core 4 Answer is that we either sell the world to the corporations who slowly drain it dry until it rots and dies, sell the world to the hidden factions in the corporate cabal and leave the future of mankind in their hands, or destroy the world personally. The best answer we get is the hope that in the future things may be better. The conflict which permeated the experience in this game is settled, but the hard work of picking up the slack and creating a new tomorrow is up in the air. The good ending asks that you put your faith in mankind. If you can't, then the bad ending's got you covered. If you think this is all just a waste of time, you can sell out those on the planet and live large while waiting for the world to die, or you can destroy those in the skies and hasten the eventual collapse. Armored Core 4 Answer is the best Armored Core game. At least, it's just as good as the first one. The fourth game sped everything up, and 4 Answer took that sped up package and delivered it to this station, fully realizing much of the latent potential of the series. Obviously, this franchise should have epic, gigantic mech fights. Subterranean or otherwise, it just makes sense to put the player in a war robot and have them methodically disable massive machinery. This is the Armored Core formula in its most sleek and polished form yet, assuming you have the framerate patches. So, what's next? Huh? In hindsight, the recalibrated gameplay, balancing around a much faster base movement speed, is about as much a slam dunk decision as they could have made, but early on, this might not have been obvious. Armored Core had an identity, and jettisoning its aesthetic in favor of this new presentation was a gamble. It's not universal to a man, but for myself, I think it paid off. They had the right team, and in the end, I feel the 4th generation games turned out excellent. So, I admire their courage to abandon this style and weigh things down considerably in the next game. Not a joke. The 5th generation games are about weight more so than speed. Does it work? Yeah. But more on that in the Armored Core 5 Retrospective. Don't click away from this video just yet though. If you enjoyed what you saw here and want to support the channel while getting early access to some videos like the Armored Core 5 and Verdict Day retrospectives and the Grass vs Estes debate, be sure to visit the channel Patreon over at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. Any support you can give is massively appreciated, as videos like this one can take a lot of time to assemble. I've been floating the idea of making a video going over the early gen spin-off titles and a big series overview style video at the end of the development of the solo videos to cap things off. And if you wanna buy me the free time it takes to assemble those, the link to the Patreon is in the video description. Fuel the mech game hyperfixation. Also, I'm still working on my game. I haven't made any progress in a few weeks now because Armored Core has more or less consumed my life, but when I've made all the videos I intend on making, somewhere in September, I figure, I'll get back around to it. Hopefully it'll be the final detour from the YouTube channel before the game is ready. For more consistent updates on the game, or if you want to have more in-depth conversations than what the YouTube commenting system allows, join the Friends of Aesir Discord server. Link in the description. This is me, signing off. Be sure to like and comment and such to feel the engagement, to tell the algorithm to spread the video and such. Thank you very much for watching. I'm AesirAesthetics. See you in the next video. But also, when I talked to Sophie about it originally, Sophie was like,
so the best thing to do is to have what you really want is to have an energy weapon, because that won't use up no ammo, and you won't have to pay for that.
but
Thank you, Hank Hill.
But I keep trying to start the games like that, and I don't think that's how you're supposed to start the games. I think you should transition into energy builds rather than start out like that.
Yeah. But that's what happens once you learn it. You realize you can do that, and something else I learned you could do early on is once you realize certain parts